Twilight, Chapter 16 Chalice. He led me back to the room that he could point it out as Chalice's office. He passed outside the door for an instant. Come in. Charlie's voice invited. Edward opened the door to a high ceilinged room with tall west facing windows. The walls were planed again in a dark wood where they were visible. Most of the wall space was taken up by towering bookshelves that reached high above my head and held more books than I could ever see outside a library. Charles sat behind a huge mahogany desk in a leather chair. He was just placing a bookmark in the pages of the thick volume he held. The room was how I could always imagine a college den could look, only Charles looks too young to fit the part. What can I do for you? He asked us pleasantly, rising from his seat. I wanted to show Bella some of our history. Edward said, well, your history, actually. We don't mean to disturb you. I apologized. Not at all. Where are you going to start? The Wagner. Edward replied, placing one hand lightly on my shoulder and spinning me around to look back towards the door we could just come through. Every time he touched me, in even the most casual way, my heart had an audible reaction. It was more embarrassing with Chalice there. The wall we faced now was different from the others. Instead of bookshelves, this wall was crowded with framed pictures of all sizes, some in vibrant colors, others dull monochromes. I searched for some logic, some binding motify the collection had in common, but I found nothing in my hasty examination. Edward pulled me towards the far left side, standing me in front of the small square oil painting in the plain wooden frame. This one did not stand out among the bigger and brighter pieces, painted in varying tones of sepia. It replicated a miniature city full of stupid slanted roofs with the thin spires atop a few scattered towers. A wide river filled the foreground, crossed by a bridge covered with structure that looked like the tiny chandeliers. London in the 1640s. Edward said, the London of my youth. Charles added, from a few feet behind us, I flinched. I had not heard him approach. Edward squeezed my hand. Well, you tell the story? Edward asked. I twisted a little to see Charles' reaction. He met my glance and smiled. I could, he replied. But I'm actually running a bit late. The hospital calling this morning, Dr. Snow is taking a sick day. Besides, you know the stories as well as I do. He added, grinning at Edward now. It was a strange combination to observe that everyday concern of the town doctor stuck in the middle of the discussion of his early days in the 17th century London. It was almost unsettling to know that he spoke aloud, only for my benefit. After another warm smile for me, Charles left the room. I stared at the little picture of Charles' hometown for a long moment. What happened then? I finally asked, starting up at Edward, who was watching me. When he realized what happened to him, he glanced back to the paintings, and I looked to see which image caught his interest now. It was a large landscape in dull fall colors, an empty shadowed meadow in a forest with a craggy peak in the distance. When he knew what he had become, Edward said quietly, he rebelled against it. He tried to destroy himself, but that is not easily done. How? I don't mean to say it loud, but the word broke through my shock. He jumped from great heights. Edward told me, his voice impassive. He tried to drown himself in the ocean, but he was into the new life and very strong. It was amazing that he was able to resist feeding while he was still so new. The instinct is more powerful than He takes over everything, but he was so repelled by himself that he had the strength to try to kill himself with starvation. Is that possible? My voice was faint. No, there are very few ways we can be killed. I opened my mouth to ask, but he spoke before I could. So he grew very hungry and eventually weak. He strayed as far as he could from the human populace, recognizing that his willpower was weakening too. For the months he wandered by night, seeking the loneliest places, loathing himself. One night, a herd of deer passed his hiding place. He was so wild with thirst that he attacked without a thought. His strength returned, and he realized there was an alternative to being the wild monster he feared. Had he not eaten the vengeance in the former life? Over the next months, his new philosophy was born. He could exist without being a demon. He found himself again. He began to make better use of his time. He could always be intelligent, eager to learn. Now he had ultimate time before him. He studied by night, planned by day. He swam to France and he swam to France? People swim the channel all the time, Bella. He reminded me patiently. That's true, I guess. Just sounded funny in the context. Go on. Swimming was easy for us. Everything was easy for you. I gripped. He waited, his expression amused. I won't interrupt again, I promise. He chuckled darkly and finished his sentence. Because technically, we don't need to breathe. You. No, you promised. He laughed, pointing his cold finger lightly to my lips. Do you want to hear the story or not? You cannot bring something like that on me and then expect me not to say anything. I mumbled against his finger. He lifted his hand, moving it to the rest against my neck. The speed of my heart reacted to that, but I persisted. You don't have to breathe, I demanded. No, it is not necessary. Just a habit. He said, how long can you go without breathing? Indefinitely, I suppose. I don't know. It's get a bit uncomfortable being without a sense of smell. A bit uncomfortable, I echoed. I was not paying attention to my own expression, but something in it made him grow sober. His hand dropped to his side, and he stood very still, his eyes intent on my face. The silence lengthened. His features were immobile as stone. What it is? I whispered, touching his frozen face. His face softened under my hand, and he sighed. I keep waiting for it to happen. For what to happen? I know that at some point something I tell you or something you say is going to be too much, and then you will run away from me, screaming as you go. He smiled, half a smile, but his eyes were serious. I won't stop you. I want this to happen. Because I want you to be safe, and yet I want to be with you. The two desires are impossible to reconcile. He trailed off, staring at my face, waiting. I'm not running anywhere. I promised. We will see, he said, smiling again. I frowned at him. So, go on. Chalice was swimming to France? He paused, getting back into his story. Reflectively, his eyes flickered to another picture, the most colorful of them all, the most oriental framed and the largest. It was twice as wide as the door it hung next to. The canvas overflowed with bright figures in swirling robes, withering around long pillars and off marbled balconies. I could not tell if it represented Greek mythology or if the characters floating in the clouds above were meant to be biblical. Chalice swam to France and continued on through Europe to the universities there. By night, he studied music, science, medicine, and found his calling, his pens, in saving human lives. His expression became awed, almost reverent. I cannot adequately describe the struggle. It took Chalice 2 centuries of torturous effort to perfect his self control. Now he is awed but immune to the scent of human blood, and he is able to do the work he loves without agony. He finds a great deal of peace there at the hospital. Edward started off into space for a long moment. Suddenly, he seems to recall his purpose. He tapped his finger against the huge painting in front of us. He was studying in Italy when he discovered the others there. They were much more civilized and educated than the veritas of the London saviors. He touched a comparatively sedate coterie of figures painted on the highest balcony, looking down calmly on the mayhem below them. I examined the grouping carefully and realized, with a startled laugh, that I recognized the golden hat man. Solimenia was greatly inspired by Charles' friends. He often painted them as gods. Edward chuckled. Arrow, Marcus, Caesar, he said, indicating the other three, two black-haired, one snow-white, knighty patrons of the arts. What happened to them? I wondered aloud, my fingertips hovering over the symmetry from the figures of the canvas. They are still there, he searched, as they have been for who knows how many millennia. Charles stayed with them only for a short time, just a few decades. He greatly admired their civility, their refinement, but they persisted in trying to cure his aversion to his natural footsteps, as they called it. They tried to persuade him, and he tried to persuade them to no avail. At that point, Charles decided to try the new world. He dreamed of finding others like himself. He was very lonely, you see. He didn't find anyone for a long time, but as monsters became the stuff of the fairy tale, he found he could interact with unsuspecting humans as if he were one of them. He began practicing medicine, but the compassion he carved evaded him. He could not risk familiarity. When the influence epidemic hit, he was working nights in the hospital in Chicago. He could be turning over an idea in his mind for several years, and he had almost decided to act. Since he could not find a companion, he could create one. He was not absolutely sure how his own transformation had occurred, so he was hesitant, and he was loath to steal anyone's life the way his had been stolen. It was in that frame of mind that he found me. There was no hope for me. I was left in the ward with the dying. He had nursed my parents, and knew I was alone. He decided to try. His voice, nearly a whisper now, trailed off. He stared unseeingly through the western windows. I wondered which images filled his mind now, Charles' memories or his own. I waited quietly. When he turned back to me, a gentle angel's smile lit his expression. And so we have come full circle, he concluded. Have you always stayed with Charles then? I wondered. Almost always. He put his hand lightly on my waist and pulled me with him as he walked through the door. I started back at the wall of the pictures, wondering if I could ever get to hear the other stories. Edward, don't say any more as we walked down the hall. So I asked. Almost. He sighed, seeming reluctant to answer. Well, I had a typical bout of rebellious adolescence by about 10 years after I was born, created, whatever you want to call it. I was not sold on his life of existence, and I resented him for curbing my appetite. So I went off on my own for a time. Really, I was intrigued rather than frightened, as I perhaps should have been, he could tell. I vaguely realized that he were headed up the next flight of stairs, but I was not paying much attention to my surroundings. That don't repulse you? No. Why not? I guess it sounds reasonable. He barked a laugh more louder than before. We were at the top of the stairs now, in other paneled hallway. From the time of my new birth, he murmured, I had the advantage of knowing what everyone around me was thinking, both human and non-human alike. That is why it took me 10 years to defy Chalas. I could read his perfect sincerity, understand exactly why he lived the way he did. It took me only a few years to return to Chalas and recommit to his vision. I thought I could be expelled from the depression that accompanies a conscience because I know the thoughts of my brain. I could pass over the innocent and purely by only the evil. If I followed a murder down a dark alley where he stalked a young girl, if I saved her, then surely I was not so terrible. I shivered, imagining only too clearly what he described the alley at the night, the frightened girl, the dark man behind her, and Edward. Edward, as he hunted, terrible and glorious as a young god, unstoppable. Could she have been grateful, that girl, or more frightened than before? But as time went on, I began to see the monster in my eyes. I could not escape the debate of so much human life taken, no matter how justified, and I went back to Charles and Esme. They welcomed me back, like the prodigal. It was more than I deserved. We could come to a stop in front of the last door in the hall. My room. He informed me, opening it and pulling me through. His room faced south, with a wall-sized window with a great room below. The whole back side of the house must be glass. His view looked down on the winding Solduke River across the untouched forest to the Olympic mountain range. The mountains were much closer than I could have believed. The western wall was completely covered with shelf after shelf of CDs. His room was better stocked than a music store. In the corner was a Spotgate-looking sound system, the kind I was afraid to touch because I could be sure to break something. There was no bed, only a wide and inviting black leather sofa. The floor was covered with a thick golden carpet, and the walls were hung with heavy fabric in the slightly dark shade. Good acoustics? I guessed. He chuckled and nodded. He picked up a remote and turned the stereo on. It was quiet, but the soft jazz numbers sounded like the band was in the room with us. I went to look at his mid-boggling music collection. How do you have these organized? I asked, unable to find any rhyme or reason to the titles. He was not paying attention. By year and then by personal preferences within that frame, he said absently. I turned and he was looking at me with a peculiar expression in his eyes. What? I was prepared to feel relieved, having you know about everything, not needing to keep secrets from you. But I don't expect to feel more than that. I like it. It makes me happy. He said, smiling slightly. I'm glad. I said, smiling back. I could worry that he might regret telling me these things. It was good to know that was not the case, but then, as his eyes distracted my expression, his smile faded and his forehead crazy. You're still waiting for the running and the screaming, or not you? I guessed. A faint smile touched his lips, and he nodded. I have to burst your bubble, but you're really not as scary as you think you are. I don't find you scary at all, actually. I lied, casually. He stopped, raising his eyebrows in blatant disbelief. Then he flashed a wide-wigged smile. You really should not have said that. He chuckled. He growled, a low sound in the back of his throat. His lips curled back over his perfect teeth. His body shifted suddenly, half crouched, tense, like a lion about to pounce. I backed away from him, glaring. You could not. I don't see him leap at me. It was much too fast. I only found myself suddenly airborne, and then we crashed onto the sofa, knocking it into the wall. All the while, his arms formed an iron cage of protection around me. I was badly jostled, but I still was gasping as I tried to right myself. He was not having that. He curled me into a ball against his chest, holding me more securely than iron chains. I glared at him in alarm, but he seemed well in control. His jaw relaxed as he grunted, his eyes brightly, only with humor. You are saying? He growled playfully that you are very, very terrifying monster. I said, mascara marred a bit by my breathless voice. Much better, he approved. Huh? I struggled. Can I get up now? He just laughed. Can we come in? A soft voice sounded from the hall. I struggled to free myself, but Edward merely readjusted me so that I was somewhat more conveniently seated on his lap. I could see it was Alice, then Jasper behind her in the doorway. My cheeks burned, but Edward seemed at ease. Go ahead. Edward was still chuckling quietly. Alice seems to find nothing unusual in our embarrassments. She walked, almost danced. Her movements were so graceful to the center of the room, where she folded herself submergedly into the floor. Jasper, however, passed at the door, his expression a trifle shocked. He stared at Edward's face, and I wondered if he was tasting the atmosphere with his unusual sensitivity. It sounded like you were having Bella for lunch, and we came to see if you could share. Alice announced. I stiffened for an instant until I realized Edward was grinning, whether I had comment or my response. I could not tell. Sorry, I don't believe I have enough to spare. He replied, his arms holding me restlessly close. Actually, Jasper said, smiling despite himself as he walked into the room. Alice says there is going to be a real storm tonight, and Emmett wants to play ball. Are you game? The words were all common enough, but the context confused me. I gathered that Alice was a bit more reliable than the weatherman, though. Edward's eyes lit up, but he hesitated. Of course, you should bring Bella. Alice cribbed. I saw Jasper throw a quick glance at her. Don't you want to go? Edward asked me, excited, his expression vivid. Sure. I could not disappoint such a face. Where are we going? We have to wait for the thunder to play ball. You will see why. He promised. Will I need an umbrella? They all three laughed aloud. Will she? Jasper asked Alice. No. She was positive. The storm will hit over town. It should be dry enough in the clearing. Good then. The enthusiasm in Jasper's voice was catching naturally. I found myself eager rather than scared stiff. Let's go and see if Chalice will come. Alice bounded up onto the door in a fashion that could break any Balerian's heart. Like you don't know. Jasper teased, and they were swiftly on their way. Jasper managed to inconspicuously close the door behind him. What will be playing? I demanded. You will be watching. Edward clarified. We will be playing baseball. I rolled my eyes. Vampires like baseball? It is an American pastime, he said with mock solemnity.